It is the 2nd of June 1953. In an historic day for the United Kingdom, Queen Elizabeth II is crowned at Westminster Abbey in London, beginning what will prove to be the longest reign in British history. TV cameras are inside the Abbey too, broadcasting live around the world, and ranks of reporters line the streets outside, hoping for a glimpse of the royal family. Suddenly, one such reporter spots an important guest brush a piece of fluff in an intimate way from the shoulder of a divorced Air Force officer named Peter Townsend, suggesting a relationship exists between them. As divorcees cannot remarry within the Church of England, the love affair will place the new Queen under severe pressure, as she is head of the Church of England, but wants her sister to be happy with the man she loves. The woman's name? Princess Margaret, the tragic sister of Elizabeth II. The woman known to history as Princess Margaret, Countess of Snowdon, was born on the 21st of August 1930 in Glamis Castle in Scotland. Her father was Prince Albert, Duke of York, the second son of King George V of the United Kingdom. Known in the royal family as Bertie, Prince Albert experienced a tough upbringing and was mercilessly mocked by his siblings and father for a speech impediment that many people viewed at the time as a symptom of him being unintelligent. As a result, he developed an introverted personality in contrast to his much more sociable older brother, the future King Edward VIII, known in the family as David. As the second son, the Duke of York did not expect to wear the royal crown, but he would become King George VI in 1936 after his elder brother King Edward VIII abdicated from the throne, following a brief reign of less than a year that was shrouded in controversy over his proposed marriage to an American woman, Wallis Simpson, who was both a divorcee and still married to another man. Margaret's mother was Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon. She came from a distinguished line of Scottish aristocrats who held the title Earl of Strathmore and Kinghorn. The family's ancestral seat was at Glamis Castle, where Margaret was born, an imposing structure in east-central Scotland, best known for its fictional association with Shakespeare's Macbeth. Elizabeth was 19 years old when the Duke of York began to court her in 1920. She initially refused him twice, until finally agreeing to marry him in 1923. Despite her noble lineage and direct descent from King Robert the Bruce of Scotland, Lady Bowes-Lyon was not of royal blood. Her marriage was welcomed as a sign of modernisation for the British royal family. In contrast to her introverted husband, the Duchess of York was self-assured and outgoing, and gave him the confidence that he often lacked. In 1926, she encouraged him to seek help from the Australian speech therapist Lionel Logue. Prince Albert gradually overcame his stammer. The tale of Logue's treatment of the king was portrayed in the 2010 award-winning film The King's Speech. The couple would have two daughters, the future Queen Elizabeth II, born on the 21st of April 1926, and Princess Margaret 4 years later in 1930. Margaret was born as fourth in line to the throne, behind her uncle, her father, and her older sister. Her birth was marked by a 41-gun salute from the Tower of London and Hyde Park on the morning of the 22nd of August. The Duke and Duchess of York had been expecting a son, so the newborn remained without a name for 2 weeks until being given the name Margaret Rose. Several Scottish queens had been called Margaret, while Rose was a reference to the white rose of the medieval House of York. Margaret's birth was not registered with the local authorities until early October, since the Duke of York, somewhat superstitiously, did not want his daughter to be the 13th name on the parish register. At the end of October, the 2-month-old princess was christened at the private chapel at Buckingham Palace by the Archbishop of Canterbury, Dr. Cosmo Lang, in the presence of 5 godparents. Although simply known as Margaret to most of the family, her sister Elizabeth called her Bud, since the child was not yet a full-grown rose, but only a bud. Princess Margaret had been born into the most famous family in the world. Her grandfather, King George V, who came to the throne in 1910, ruled over an empire of almost 14 million square miles and a population of just under 500 million people. As a constitutional monarch, he had little political power at home, but his likeness was to be found on coins, stamps, and banknotes all over the globe from Canada to Cape Town. Meanwhile, the collapse of monarchy in Russia, Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Turkey during and after the First World War meant that the House of Windsor was the only European royal dynasty of any significance left standing by the 1920s. The British royal family's prestige was marked by grand ceremonial occasions such as the state opening of Parliament and the celebration of the sovereign's official birthday known as Trooping the Colour. In addition to this, there was a steady stream of social events such as the races at Ascot and numerous balls and garden parties throughout the year. While the British court was officially based at St James's Palace, the monarch's primary London residences had been at Buckingham Palace and Windsor Castle since the days of Queen Victoria. King George also spent his summer holidays at Balmoral Castle in Scotland and Christmas at his beloved Sandringham House in Norfolk, a tradition that continues to this day. King George V and his wife Queen Mary were, above all, concerned with upholding the dignity of the British monarchy. At a time when the concept of monarchy was looking increasingly outdated, King George had played his part in modernising the institution to ensure its survival. After becoming king in 1910, he dropped the royal objection to the Liberal government's plans to limit the power of the House of Lords, and in January 1924 he appointed Ramsay MacDonald as the first Prime Minister from the Labour Party. Although the first Labour administration lasted less than a year, the King and MacDonald became close personal friends, and the Labour leader returned to office after the general election of May 1929. These developments aside, George V remained naturally conservative and expected a level of conservative and tradition-bound behaviour of the rest of the royal family. Margaret grew up in this environment. For the first 6 years of Margaret's life, the family split their time between their 5-storey London townhouse at 145 Piccadilly and the Royal Lodge at Windsor, a charming cottage enlarged and restored on the instructions of the Duchess of York. Recalling his own troubled childhood, Prince Albert wanted his daughters to grow up in a happy family environment. The Duke and Duchess played rowdy party games with their daughters, and in the evening the sounds of splashing in the bathtub or pillow fights in the children's bedroom frequently reverberated to the lower floors. Although they spent more time with their parents than most royal and aristocratic children, the girls' upbringing was entrusted to a nanny, Clara Knight, who had been the Duchess's own nanny 3 decades earlier. The Duchess took a traditional approach to her daughter's education and believed that while royal princesses should be taught how to behave with grace and decorum, any intellectual studies were to be limited. With this in mind, in 1932, she appointed the Scotswoman Marion Crawford as the governess to the young princesses. The newcomer, nicknamed Crawfie by the girls, had a major impact on her royal charges and broadened their horizons. She did so, firstly, by taking them for walks in Hyde Park, and later by going around London on buses and underground trains. Crawfie remained in royal service for 15 years until both girls reached adulthood, but damaged her relationship with the family by indiscreetly writing a book entitled The Little Princesses, published in 1950, in which she portrayed Elizabeth as the model of grace and good character, in contrast to her wild and untamed younger sister. Although Margaret would regard the book as a betrayal of royal confidence, there was much truth in Crawford's account. An accomplished singer and pianist, Margaret had a particular talent for mimicry which often had her parents and sister in fits of laughter. She preferred dancing and music to her lessons of arithmetic, history, literature and geography, and often used her imagination to delay the start of lessons by regaling Crawford with tales of rampaging elephants or talking cats that she claimed to have seen in her dreams. The study of history and geography was encouraged by the girls' grandmother, Queen Mary, who took them on trips to museums and art galleries to instill in them a sense of their family's place in the world as well as their duties as royals. During the early 1930s, Uncle David, the Prince of Wales, was a regular visitor to the Piccadilly house and would often participate in family games with the girls. However, the future Edward VIII's relations with his family would come under pressure due to his relationship with Wallis Simpson, whose background and social status was deemed to be unsuitable for a potential future Queen of the United Kingdom. The Duke of York hoped that his brother would soon abandon his American mistress. His failure to do so meant that his invitations to visit the Piccadilly house became much rarer. The Wallis-Simpson affair would cast a long shadow on the lives of the British royal family, and the tensions which surrounded it must have been palpable throughout Margaret's childhood years. As a member of the royal family, Princess Margaret was on public display at ceremonial events from a very young age. On the 6th of May 1935, she shared a carriage with her sister Elizabeth during King George V's Silver Jubilee procession through London to mark his 25th year on the throne. Despite the display of regal majesty, the 70-year-old king was in very poor health by then and died at Sandringham less than a year later on the 20th of January 1936, after a sombre Christmas gathering with the family. The 5-year-old Princess Margaret, now third in line to the throne, initially struggled to comprehend what had happened to her grandfather, but remarked to her nanny on the day of the funeral, "Grandpapa has gone to heaven, and I'm sure that God is finding him very useful." Uncle David was now King Edward VIII, To outside observers, there was no reason to doubt that the new king would remain on the throne for several decades. However, it soon dawned upon the royal family that King Edward was determined to marry Wallis Simpson and wanted to do so in time for her to be crowned queen alongside him on the 12th of May 1937. Leaving aside all the other reasons why Wallis Simpson would be an unsuitable queen consort, King Edward VIII was head of the Church of England, the canon law of which forbade divorce. The Duke of York, now heir to the throne, was appalled by his brother's insistence on presenting Mrs. Simpson at court, and the affair came to international attention in the summer when the king and his mistress went on a yachting holiday off the Dalmatian coast of Yugoslavia. In late October, Wallis was finally granted a divorce from her second husband, Ernest Simpson, thus removing the first obstacle to the king's plan to marry her. This forced the hand of the Conservative Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin, who then intervened and informed the sovereign that he could not expect to marry his mistress and keep the throne at the same time. Edward told the Prime Minister that if forced to choose, he would keep his lover and abdicate the throne. After the news became public on the 2nd of December, the house at 145 Piccadilly became a hive of activity as prominent political and ecclesiastical figures went in and out to confer with the Duke of York. One wonders how much of all of this 6-year-old Margaret was conscious of. After a few days of frantic negotiations, Edward VIII agreed to abdicate, and he signed the instrument of abdication on the 10th of December, which was ratified by Parliament the following day. The new king, Margaret's father, took the regnal name King George VI, while the former king was given the title of Duke of Windsor and went into exile in France. The introverted Duke of York could think of nothing worse than becoming king, and Princess Elizabeth was saddened to leave the familiar surroundings of the Piccadilly townhouse for Buckingham Palace. The girls remained at Piccadilly for 2 months before making the move. As a result of the King and Queen's royal duties, the princesses saw much less of their parents than they had at Piccadilly. The British public were comforted by the fact that a young, happy family now lived in Buckingham Palace, one in stark contrast to the scandalous Edward VIII and the sombre and solemn mood of King George V's final years. They recognised in George VI a conscientious monarch who was determined to do his duty to his country and his subjects, while Queen Elizabeth demonstrated her regal bearing and set new fashion standards by wearing pastel colours during the day and fabulous crinoline dresses at night. George VI was crowned king on the 12th of May 1937, the date that had originally been intended for his brother's coronation. Margaret accompanied her sister at the front of the royal procession into Westminster Abbey. Despite Elizabeth's fears that she would find the ceremony too tedious, Margaret remained on her best behaviour, sitting next to her grandmother, Queen Mary, in the royal gallery. The elderly Dowager Queen intensified her efforts to educate her granddaughters in royal culture, and Margaret recalled her exhaustion struggling to keep up with her grandmother in museums and galleries. For her whole life, Margaret had been brought up alongside Elizabeth, but the accession of their father led to a major change in their respective statuses. Although she could still be superseded by a younger brother, Elizabeth was now heir to the crown and had to be prepared for the duties of a monarch. When Princess Elizabeth began taking constitutional history lessons in 1939, her younger sister was absent. With Elizabeth at the centre of attention, Margaret was allowed to be more extroverted without being subject to the strict disciplinary standards set for her sister. Despite these developments and the differences in their personalities, the two sisters would remain close for the rest of their lives. In the meantime, the outbreak of the Second World War in September 1939 affected the lives of King George VI's subjects in Britain and overseas. The family had been at Balmoral, and the king had to rush back to London in late August as Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union signed the non-aggression pact that led to the invasion of Poland. While the girls remained in Scotland and were separated from their parents, life seemed to go on as normal, and in December the family was able to celebrate Christmas at Sandringham. In February 1940, the princesses went to the Royal Lodge, but when the German war machine began rolling into northern and western Europe, they moved into Windsor Castle in May. Margaret later reflected that while there was no chance of the castle's heavy guard resisting a German invasion, they did a good job of keeping them inside. Despite talk in royal circles of evacuating the princesses to Canada, Queen Elizabeth argued that she could not be without her daughters, and since her duty was to be with her husband, the girls should also stay in Britain. The King and Queen remained in London, even as the German Luftwaffe began bombing England in the summer. They received considerable public sympathy when Buckingham Palace was hit in September. The girls stayed at Windsor throughout the war and only saw their parents at the weekends and on some other rare occasions. Princess Margaret later learned that plans were in place to swiftly evacuate the family to Canada via Liverpool if a German invasion had taken place. By the time they arrived in Windsor, the priceless artistic treasures had been removed for safekeeping, fuel-saving measures meant that the rooms were often cold, and regular air raid sirens compelled the girls to rush to the bomb shelter, hastily converted from an underground dungeon. While the royal family did not suffer any real shortages, the princesses had their food and clothes rationed as a demonstration of solidarity and contributed to the war effort by growing vegetables in the gardens and knitting garments for the troops. During the war, the girls had to make their own entertainment, and from 1941 onwards, the princesses staged Christmas pantomimes for a public audience, with Princess Elizabeth in the lead male role and Margaret as the leading lady. In order to liven up the castle's decor, Margaret began inserting pantomime posters into empty picture frames that once contained portraits of British royals. This greatly amused the king, who once asked a guest, "What do you think of my ancestors?" while gesturing at the likes of Cinderella and Aladdin. By early 1941, the invasion threat had receded after British airmen defeated the Luftwaffe in the Battle of Britain. As a result, the girls were able to take trips to the Sandringham estate and even Balmoral. At Windsor, Princess Margaret enjoyed leading young guards officers by the hand and showing them around the castle. German bombs and later V-2 rockets would continue to terrorize the people of England, but the worst of the threat had passed. Despite the humiliating capitulation of Singapore to Japanese forces in February 1942, the fortunes of the British and their allies were slowly improving. In June, the United States turned the tables in the Pacific against the Japanese with victory at the Battle of Midway Island, and in November the British Eighth Army secured control of North Africa by defeating the Germans at El Alamein. In the meantime, the German invasion of the Soviet Union was grinding to a halt amidst desperate fighting at Stalingrad. At Windsor, the princesses entertained groups of visiting American servicemen preparing to take part in the amphibious landings in Normandy in June 1944. With the war drawing to a close, both princesses were in their teens and had already been acquainted with men who were to play major parts in their lives. At the beginning of the war, Elizabeth had met Prince Philip of Greece and Denmark, a cousin serving in the Royal Navy. She quickly fell in love with him. The pair remained in touch throughout the war, and Philip was occasionally invited to Windsor Castle on his breaks. Another familiar face at Windsor was Group Captain Peter Townsend, a 29-year-old fighter pilot who had distinguished himself during the Battle of Britain and was appointed equerry to the King in early 1944. While Margaret was only 14 at the time and did not make much of an initial impression on Group Captain Townsend, that was to change within a few short years. By this point, everyone was already looking forward to the end of the war, which came in Europe on the 8th of May 1945, though it would continue in Asia against the Japanese until the autumn. That evening, the King allowed his daughters to mingle with the jubilant crowds through the streets of London. They then made their way back to the palace and joined in with the masses chanting, "We want the King, we want the Queen," and their parents made an appearance on the balcony. King George was eager to rebuild the family life that they had enjoyed before the war. However, his daughters had grown up in the course of the conflict, and Elizabeth was now a young woman. In autumn 1946, she accepted a proposal from Prince Philip. The King ensured the engagement remained secret, and in February 1947, the royal family departed on a 3-month tour of South Africa, where apartheid had not yet been fully implemented. This was the 16-year-old Margaret's first foreign trip, and her first extended period in the public spotlight. Despite an exhausting calendar of engagements, Margaret was seen as a charming, attractive young princess who enjoyed a good laugh. The family were in South Africa for Elizabeth's 21st birthday on the 21st of April 1947, during which she gave a memorable address, making a solemn act of dedication to the British Commonwealth. Ultimately, the royal visit could not prevent the anti-monarchist National Party from winning the 1948 elections in South Africa and introducing apartheid thereafter. Princess Margaret returned to Britain in May with diamond gifts, broadened horizons, and a love of travel. A couple of months later, Princess Elizabeth's engagement with Prince Philip was officially announced, though the groom had to wait until the morning of his wedding to become Duke of Edinburgh. The wedding of Princess Elizabeth and the Duke of Edinburgh on the 20th of November 1947 at Westminster Abbey was the first great royal event after the war. Walking alone in the procession behind the bride and ahead of the other 7 bridesmaids, Princess Margaret appeared graceful and self-assured in her performance. The event was a symbol of the return to some normality in a country where post-war rationing was still in place and where the rebuilding of the country would take several years. Following her sister's marriage, Princess Margaret was now the most eligible woman in the world. For over a decade, she would capture the attention of the international press wherever she went. Her star power was similar to the likes of Marilyn Monroe, Elizabeth Taylor, and even Grace Kelly, who was to become a princess herself, after marrying Prince Rainier of Monaco in 1956. As well as her charm, beauty, and vivaciousness, the teenage princess became a leader in women's fashion by embracing Christian Dior's New Look collection, characterized by a narrow waist, low hemlines, and high heels. During the immediate post-war years, with her father often ill and her sister encumbered by pregnancies, Princess Margaret carried out royal engagements at schools, hospitals, and charitable institutions all over the country. At the same time, she courted controversy for visiting nightclubs and private parties and dancing with friends until the early hours. The rumour mill linked the princess to a host of male acquaintances, including the comedian Danny Kaye and the actor Noel Coward, both of whom were close friends. Her late-night antics were tolerated by her parents, particularly after she moved one step further from the throne when her sister gave birth to Prince Charles on the 14th of November 1948. On a visit to Italy and France in spring 1949, Margaret found herself stalked and mobbed by photographers, one of whom used a telephoto lens to take a picture of her swimming off Capri in a pale bathing suit which gave the impression she was swimming in the nude. In Paris, she met Christian Dior and thanked him for creating the new look and ordered a strapless ball gown. After her return to England, the diarist and conservative politician Chips Channon observed of the young princess, "There is already a Marie Antoinette aroma about her," warning of the alleged risk she posed to the royal family. Nevertheless, under the playful facade was a young lady with a curious and intellectual mind, deep religious convictions, and a sense of fragility that only made itself known to her closest associates. With her father's health in continued decline from heart problems, compounded by his chronic smoking over many years, Margaret had a full calendar of engagements before celebrating her 21st birthday at Balmoral in August 1951. Among the attendees was the Scottish aristocrat Johnny Dalkeith, whom King George hoped she would marry. However, by now, she and Group Captain Townsend had fallen in love with each other. Townsend had accompanied the princess on most of her foreign trips, and the romance developed gradually over the years. Although already married, Townsend's royal duties often kept him apart from his wife Rosemary. While the king may have sensed that his younger daughter had eyes for Group Captain Townsend, he would have hoped that it was a youthful crush that would soon go away. However, when the time came, it would not be his decision to make. Around this time, George VI was diagnosed with a tumour and had an operation in 1951 to have his left lung removed. Although the procedure appeared to be successful, the king remained weak. He never fully recovered and died on the 6th of February 1952 at Sandringham after spending Christmas with the family. Days before, he had bid farewell to Princess Elizabeth and the Duke of Edinburgh as they departed for a tour of the Commonwealth nations. The late king's eldest daughter was in Kenya when she learned of her father's death and her accession as Queen Elizabeth II, while her widowed mother came to be known as the Queen Mother. After marrying Prince Philip, Elizabeth had moved with him to Clarence House, on the grounds of St. James's Palace, but following George VI's death, the new queen moved into Buckingham Palace, while her mother and sister went to live in Clarence House, which would be Margaret's home for the next 8 years. In the wake of her father's death, Princess Margaret sought consolation both in God and in the person of Group Captain Peter Townsend. Completely oblivious to the budding romance, the Queen Mother appointed Townsend as comptroller of her household, hoping that he could bring some stability to her daughter. Meanwhile, Townsend discovered that his wife was having an affair with John de Laszlo, the son of a court painter. This encouraged him to seek a divorce and intensify his pursuit of the princess. According to Townsend's memoirs, it was only after his divorce that he and Margaret declared their love for each other, though Margaret's biographer, Theo Aronson, suggests that the affair had been going on for some time. When the couple announced their intention to marry in early 1953, Queen Elizabeth was sympathetic, the Queen Mother was privately aghast, and the Duke of Edinburgh laughed it off. Under the 1772 law governing royal marriages, Princess Margaret would have to seek the Queen's permission to marry before she turned 25, and after that age, Parliament would rule on the matter. As the royal family had no desire to be mired in controversy before Queen Elizabeth's coronation in June, the Queen advised her sister to wait a year. On the 2nd of June, Princess Margaret shimmered in a white satin dress as she walked up the nave of Westminster Abbey alongside her mother and her 4-year-old nephew, Prince Charles. As she left the Abbey at the end of the ceremony and waited for her carriage, she saw Group Captain Townsend standing to attention and brushed his uniform. This intimate gesture immediately set the rumour mill running, and the international press broke the story the following morning. When the British press broke its silence on the 14th of June, the Queen's private secretary, Sir Alan Lascelles, urgently informed the Prime Minister, Winston Churchill's private secretary. Churchill initially welcomed the idea of a war hero marrying the glamorous princess, but was reminded of the abdication crisis with Edward VIII back in 1936, and agreed to oppose the match. On the 15th of June, Lascelles informed the Queen that Peter Townsend had to be sent away. She reluctantly agreed to post him abroad for 2 years, though it concerned her that this would upset Margaret. Townsend was surprised by the news, but agreed to go. Townsend informed Margaret on the 30th of June, just before she and her mother left on a visit to Rhodesia, the name at the time for Zimbabwe. A few days into the trip, the Queen Mother told her daughter that Group Captain Townsend's departure was brought forward to the 15th of July, the day before they were due to return to London. For the next 4 days, Princess Margaret absented herself from her duties, and it was rumoured that she had flown into a rage at her mother and returned alone to the Rhodesian capital of Salisbury, modern-day Harare. Back in England, Group Captain Townsend's banishment did little to stem press speculation. The future leader of the Labour Party, Michael Foot, thundered at the double standards of a Conservative government withholding their consent when 3 cabinet ministers were themselves divorced, while 95% of respondents to a Daily Mirror poll agreed that Margaret should be allowed to marry whoever she wanted, regardless of their 16-year age difference, his social status, or his previous marriage. A few weeks later, Parliament began debating an amendment to the Regency Act of 1937 to replace Princess Margaret with Prince Philip as regent in the event of the Queen's incapacity. Although the Queen simply wanted to have her husband assume the regency on behalf of their son, the press speculated whether this was to punish Princess Margaret or to pave the way for her marriage to Group Captain Townsend. As the unrest continued, Princess Margaret decided that she would have to wait until her 25th birthday before she would be allowed to marry of her own volition. Contrary to press speculation, she remained committed to Townsend and was constantly in touch with him on the phone. She continued to carry out royal duties, such as her visit to Germany in 1954, the first by a British royal to the country since before the First World War. This was an important event in affirming Britain's mended relations with West Germany in the context of the Cold War. In February 1955, she made the first of many visits to the Caribbean, where her outgoing personality was well received. However, when she celebrated her much-anticipated 25th birthday at Balmoral, no statement from the royal family was forthcoming about her marital plans, while Queen Elizabeth had chosen to be silent on the matter. The elderly Churchill had resigned as Prime Minister and was replaced by Sir Anthony Eden, himself a divorced and remarried man. Whatever awkwardness Eden may have had in setting out his position, his cabinet remained firmly opposed, and there was little prospect of parliamentary approval. On the 13th of October 1955, Margaret returned to Clarence House to be reunited with Townsend, and for the next 3 weeks the couple rarely escaped press attention. Despite their initial optimism, on the 23rd of October, Queen Elizabeth informed her sister that she would only be allowed to marry Townsend in a civil ceremony, and that she would have to renounce her titles, her rights to the throne, and her income from the royal household. To Margaret, this was unthinkable. It was not simply a matter of her lifestyle being impacted. She would also be ostracized from her family, like the Duke of Windsor years earlier, and prevented from being a working royal going forward. Within hours, Margaret decided that she could not marry Townsend. The pair drafted a statement of renunciation, which Margaret delivered on the 31st of October. For all her reputation as a maverick, Margaret placed duty above love. She gained much public sympathy for it. Following the traumatic separation, Margaret became more active socially and strengthened her association with the entertainment world. She frequented the theatre and cinema and enjoyed singing along to Frank Sinatra and Ella Fitzgerald. She continued to join friends at restaurants and clubs and brought them back to Clarence House for after-parties that rarely ended before daybreak. Margaret's reputation was such that a German cartoonist pictured the Queen asking her sister to do something to distract the press from the Suez Crisis in 1956. Meanwhile, a new wave of speculation rose as to which European prince or British aristocrat Princess Margaret was going to marry now that her long-running courtship with Townsend had come to an end. Nearly all of Margaret's young aristocratic friends were now married. The major exception was Billy Wallis, the untitled but extremely wealthy son of a former Conservative government minister. Wallis had proposed to Margaret on several occasions and been rejected politely, but following her breakup with Townsend, his proposal was finally accepted. The pair were unofficially engaged for several months until Wallis went to the Bahamas and admitted to a brief holiday romance. In March 1958, Peter Townsend returned to England after an 18-month round-the-world tour. The 43-year-old group captain's ardour for the princess had not cooled, and the pair met on several occasions. Unwelcome press speculation that they had now been given permission to marry was vehemently denied by the palace. Instead, on the 20th of May 1958, they decided that they could no longer see each other and that Margaret would marry someone else. For all her faults, many of which were still unknown to the British public, Princess Margaret was a breath of fresh air in a royal family that was seen as increasingly out of touch with a changing Britain, one freed from the conservative mores of the Age of Empire. As the Queen began to modernise the institution by inviting journalists and cultural figures to lunch and by opening up Buckingham Palace's garden parties to a wider section of the public, Princess Margaret's social skills were invaluable in keeping the conversation flowing. The Queen also recognised that her sister was an important asset on the international stage. Margaret travelled extensively in Europe and in the Commonwealth nations, though her visits did little to prevent a host of African and Caribbean countries from declaring independence from the British Empire in the late 1950s and into the 1960s. Princess Margaret was now in her late 20s, and it was rare for a British princess to remain unmarried at that age. The catalyst came in October 1959, when she received word from Peter Townsend that he was planning to marry a young Belgian heiress. She was at Balmoral at the time with the photographer Antony Armstrong-Jones, whom she first met in February 1958 and became romantically involved with after breaking off her relationship with Townsend. Princess Margaret found in Armstrong-Jones an extrovert who shared her interest in art, ballet, theatre and fashion. Before long, he was helping Margaret design her dresses, while the princess was giving him feedback on his photography. The relationship escaped press attention for a long time because nobody could imagine the princess being in love with a photographer. She still avoided visiting Armstrong-Jones's studio in Pimlico too often to ensure the relationship did not come to public attention. Instead, the couple met in a rented room in an unassuming terraced house at 59 Rotherhithe Street, south of the Thames. When the Queen and Queen Mother were informed of the relationship in the summer of 1959, they were surprised, but could not withhold their consent again after what they had put Margaret through over many years with Peter Townsend. The couple were privately engaged at Balmoral, and the Queen gave her formal consent in January 1960. Not everyone was in favour of the match. Armstrong-Jones's father, for instance, considered his son too independent-minded to play second fiddle to a princess, and also worried about his lack of exposure to royal etiquette and the media scrutiny that came with it. The announcement of the engagement in late February was eagerly welcomed by the British public, but there was some embarrassment when many of Europe's remaining royal families did not send representatives. The wedding on the 6th of May 1960 was the first royal wedding to be televised, and an estimated 300 million viewers worldwide saw the bride processing down the nave in a dress of relative simplicity designed by her husband, enhancing the effect of her diamond tiara. Following the ceremony, the newlyweds immediately set off on their Caribbean honeymoon on board the royal yacht Britannia. The couple visited the small island of Mustique in what is now St. Vincent and the Grenadines. The island had been bought by Princess Margaret's old friend Colin Tennant, later the 3rd Baron Glenconner, who planned to develop it into a private island resort. Tennant offered his royal friend a plot of land as a wedding present, and she accompanied her husband to identify a suitable location. While the princess would become a frequent visitor to Mustique over the years, her husband seemed jealous of Tennant's long-standing friendship with his wife and never set foot on the island again. It was an ominous sign of things to come in the marriage. On their return to England, the couple moved into a house at No. 10 Kensington Palace, and later into the more spacious apartment 1A Clock Court, where Margaret would live for the rest of her life. The renovation of the rooms cost £85,000, an enormous sum, which was criticised in Parliament and in public at a time of economic difficulty. Armstrong-Jones, created Earl of Snowdon in October 1961, struggled to fit into his new surroundings, and his informal manner with the royal servants was rebuked by his wife. Furthermore, Snowden was restless about finding something to do after being forced to close his photography studio. When Margaret helped her husband to secure a position as artistic advisor for the Sunday Times New Colour magazine in January 1962, a public storm ensued over claims of royal favouritism. A few weeks earlier, on the 3rd of November 1961, Margaret had given birth to her first child, a son named David, who assumed his father's courtesy title of Viscount Linley. The Snowdons soon went on holiday to the Caribbean, leaving their newborn with a nanny. Even sympathetic reporters began to criticise Princess Margaret's self-indulgence and neglect of family duties. Unlike the rest of the royal family, who routinely went on their holidays within the British Isles, the Snowdons enjoyed their holidays in exclusive Mediterranean resorts hosted by the likes of Greek shipping magnate Stavros Niarchos and the Aga Khan, the wealthy spiritual leader of the Ismaili Muslims. At home, the Snowdons were Britain's most fashionable couple. Under her husband's influence, the princess began to dress in a simpler style with shorter skirts. They eagerly cut through the British class system and befriended the Beatles, though Margaret remained conscious of her status and the disapproving glare she shot at anyone who behaved too informally became somewhat infamous. They continued to make occasional visits to the house in Rotherhithe until 1964, when the local council decided to bulldoze the terrace for redevelopment. Back at Kensington Palace, Margaret had given birth to a daughter, Lady Sarah, in May 1964. Despite outward appearances, serious marital tensions had already begun to show themselves, even before the birth of the Snowdons' second child. Although he initially made an effort to carry out his royal duties conscientiously alongside his wife, the Earl of Snowdon found his job at the Sunday Times far more interesting than what he perceived as the tedium of royal duties. Within a few years, he was spending more time in his study working and less time entertaining his wife's dinner guests. A major rift opened in 1965 when the couple were choosing a weekend retreat outside London. While Princess Margaret preferred to build a house at Sunninghill near Windsor, her husband favoured restoring a Sussex cottage known as the Old House. Earl Snowdon outwardly agreed to the Sunninghill project, but began carrying out renovations to the old house at the same time behind his wife's back. Margaret was infuriated when she learned this and rarely visited the country retreat, which she considered too inaccessible from London. Outwardly, husband and wife continued to appear side by side at events in Britain and further afield, but behind closed doors, the marriage was in trouble. In November 1965, they made a well-publicized tour of the United States, the highlight of which was a visit to the White House, hosted by President Lyndon B. Johnson and his wife, Lady Bird Johnson. The couple also found time to visit Hollywood, where the princess got into spats with Elizabeth Taylor and Grace Kelly. The most memorable confrontation was with the actress Judy Garland, who dismissed an invitation to sing for the princess in her hotel room. With her husband often abroad carrying out assignments for the Sunday Times, the 35-year-old Princess Margaret experienced bouts of loneliness which she sought to overcome with heavy smoking and drinking. In early 1966, Margaret had a brief affair with Anthony Barton, a family friend who was a godfather to her daughter Sarah. It was later rumoured that her husband had set them up to facilitate his own independence. Late in 1966, Margaret began a passionate affair with Robin Douglas Hume, an aristocratic army major whose uncle, Sir Alec Douglas Hume, had recently been Prime Minister. The younger Douglas Hume had a reputation for seducing neglected wives in high society, and the lonely princess quickly fell for his charms. However, by the end of March 1967, Margaret was obliged to end the affair in response to press speculation that her marriage was falling apart, and a heartbroken Douglas Hume took his own life the following October. Despite a public display of reconciliation, the Snowdons continued to drift apart when Margaret issued instructions to begin work on her villa in Mustique, named Les Jolies Eaux. Amidst the turbulence in her private life, Margaret continued to be a fixture at state occasions, such as the investiture of her nephew Prince Charles as Prince of Wales at Carnarvon Castle in July 1969. The Earl of Snowdon had been asked to design the pageant and boldly cast aside the traditional royal ostentation in favour of a minimalist approach. The ceremony was a triumph for Snowdon at a time when his wife's reputation continued to decline. The public sensed that while Princess Margaret owed her fame to her birth, her husband was worthy of recognition for his artistic talents. While Antony, who had contracted polio as a child, served as patron of disabilities charities, Margaret was known as a woman without a cause, and neither her presidency of the Royal Ballet nor her chancellorship of Keele University caught the public imagination. The Snowdons continued to represent the British monarchy on international trips, but by the end of a long Asian tour in September 1969, they were barely on speaking terms. Rumours linking Antony to the 23-year-old Lady Jacqueline Rufus Isaacs, daughter of the 3rd Marquess of Reading, marked the beginning of the end. In her continued quest for male company, in the early 1970s, Margaret became close friends with the rock star Mick Jagger, while the actor Peter Sellers regularly took her out on dates and was confident that he would marry her. By this stage, Margaret's husband was ready for a divorce, but the subject remained a painful one for the royal family, and Margaret did not consider it a realistic option. Her popularity took a further hit in 1972, when the Parliamentary Committee examining a proposed increase in her allowance through the civil list recommended that it should be abolished entirely. Despite press headlines asking whether Princess Margaret's work represented value for money, the Conservative majority in the Commons ensured that she received her planned increase. In 1973, at the age of 43, the princess had her life transformed by the 25-year-old Roderick Llewellyn, a sociable young man from a wealthy Welsh family who had been introduced to her by Colin Tennant. Despite the age gap, Princess Margaret took every opportunity to see her young lover at his basement flat in Fulham. In 1974, she invited him to Mustique, where he discovered a talent and passion for gardening. However, the young man was ill at ease with the affair, and within a year of their first meeting he suffered a mental breakdown and spent several weeks in Turkey. His disappearance caused Margaret considerable distress, leading her to overdose on sleeping pills. One weekend, the desperate princess telephoned a male friend and threatened to throw herself out of her bedroom window if he did not visit immediately. The anxious friend telephoned the Queen, who reassured him that her sister's bedroom was on the ground floor and advised him to continue with his house party. After several months recuperating in the Welsh countryside, Llewellyn regained his composure and resumed his relationship with Margaret. The Queen and Queen Mother were appalled by the affair and sympathised with the Earl of Snowdon, even though he was having an affair of his own with his production assistant, Lucy Lindsay-Hogg. The relationship with Llewellyn finally became public knowledge in February 1976, when the pair were photographed together in Mustique. After returning to Britain, Princess Margaret announced her separation from her husband and began to carry out her engagements alone. At the Queen's Silver Jubilee in 1977, Margaret and her children played a prominent role in the procession, while Snowden was relegated to the congregation. Behind the scenes, Llewellyn and Margaret's relationship survived the ordeal, and within weeks of her separation from her husband, the pair began seeing each other again. The couple's holidays to Mustique were easy fodder for the tabloids, and a photograph taken by the princess featuring Llewellyn and two other male friends completely naked found its way into the pages of Rupert Murdoch's News of the World. Princess Margaret's public image suffered further when her lover decided that he wanted to be a pop singer after initially struggling to find work as a gardener. On a visit to Mustique in March 1978, Llewellyn fell ill and was flown to hospital in Barbados. Images of the princess enjoying herself in the Caribbean sun invited a barrage of hostile attacks from Labour politicians who proposed that her allowance be eliminated or, at the very least, redistributed to more deserving members of the royal family. While establishment papers rallied to Margaret's defence, there was a widespread sense that her behaviour was inappropriate for a public figure. The constant negative press impacted Margaret's health, and she was hospitalised with hepatitis in May 1978. While still in hospital, she petitioned for a divorce. Her frail appearance leaving hospital the following day was accompanied by a wave of public sympathy. The divorce was granted just 2 months later. While Margaret was pitied as the tragic princess, her popularity relative to her sister was a complete reversal of the 1960s. At a time of political and economic upheaval, the Queen represented stability and permanence, while her eldest children, Prince Charles and Princess Anne, were praised for their interest in charitable causes. In the words of one biographer, the public saw Princess Margaret as a, quote, selfish, arrogant and capricious personality during the latter part of her life. For all the press criticism, Margaret remained dedicated to her sister and her family, and continued to carry out her royal duties, often at the expense of her health. In autumn 1978, she flew halfway across the world for the independence ceremony of the Pacific nation of Tuvalu, and was taken ill with pneumonia, but was back on her feet within less than 10 days and resumed her international engagements. Battling ill health and negative press, Margaret continued to count on Roddy Llewellyn's affections, though the latter's conviction for drink driving in early 1979 did little to improve her image. In August 1979, Princess Margaret courted major controversy during a visit to the United States. A few weeks earlier, her cousin, the British war hero and mentor to Prince Charles, Lord Mountbatten, had been killed by a bomb placed by the Irish Republican Army while holidaying in Ireland. The mayor of Chicago, Jane Byrne, informed the princess that she had been a member of the American delegation to Mountbatten's funeral. According to news reports, the princess said, "The Irish, they're pigs," only to be told that Mrs. Byrne was very proud of her Irish ancestry. While Margaret denied making the remark, it infuriated a large proportion of the influential Irish-American community in the United States. In Los Angeles, she was given additional security in light of an alleged IRA plot to assassinate her, and a planned visit to Washington, D.C. in 1980 was cancelled. As she approached her 50th birthday in 1980, Margaret appeared revitalized after undergoing plastic surgery and losing considerable weight. After an extensive series of engagements, including tours to Asia and Canada, she marked her mother's 80th birthday in the summer before celebrating her 50th at the Ritz in November. The Queen ensured that Roddy Llewellyn was not invited to dinner. When he arrived for the post-dinner dance, he kept his distance until the Queen and Prince Philip left. By that point, the relationship was already running out of steam, and in February 1981, Llewellyn announced that he had fallen in love with the Parisian fashion designer Tatiana Soskin and intended to marry her. While Margaret gave her fulsome blessing to the match, the breakup caused her to feel isolated and emotionally unfulfilled. The year proved a major turning point in Margaret's life, and after the wedding of Prince Charles to Lady Diana Spencer in July 1981, Margaret ceded her place in the limelight to the glamorous Princess of Wales. Throughout the 1980s, Margaret's name continued to be linked with various male companions, but she never gave serious thought to remarriage. For all her private troubles, Margaret remained a good mother to her 2 children and encouraged them to pursue the artistic talents they inherited from their father. Her son David, Viscount Linley and later 2nd Earl of Snowdon, became a talented cabinet maker and honorary head of Christie's auction house, while her daughter Sarah Armstrong-Jones worked as a designer. A silver lining following the separation from Llewellyn was an improvement in Princess Margaret's relationship with her sister, the Queen. The tensions which had existed between them for many years declined as Margaret fell out of the new cycle. The princess had a reasonable bond as well with her 3 nephews, Charles, Andrew, and Edward. She had a much better relationship with her niece, Elizabeth's only daughter, Princess Anne, a similarly outspoken royal princess who had been heavily criticised by the press during the 1970s for reasons which mirrored Margaret's own past. Anne's first marriage to Mark Phillips had become fodder for the newspapers and ended in separation and divorce, while Anne had also broken with some royal norms by becoming a respected equestrian and even competed at the Olympic Games in Montreal, in Canada, in 1976. Margaret also became close to her niece-in-law, Princess Diana, and helped her to cope with unwanted press attention after marrying Prince Charles. She often defended Diana to the rest of the royal family, arguing that she needed time to grow into the position of queen-in-waiting, though their relationship became more complicated over time as Diana and Charles's marriage descended into mutual affairs. Although they maintained a facade for the public and for the sake of their children through the late 1980s and into the early 1990s, the collapse of the marriage became official in 1992. As this happened, Margaret, as a member of the royal family, drifted away from Diana. Conversely, she grew closer to Charles. Her own experiences many years earlier mirrored his in some ways, with the press depicting the Prince of Wales as the villain in the collapse of the royal marriage, something which was similar to the poor press coverage of Margaret at times back in the 1960s and 1970s. Margaret was also increasingly struggling with health issues. She had lived a much less healthy lifestyle than her sister, and, in 1985, she was admitted to hospital for a procedure to remove what turned out to be a non-malignant growth from her left lung. Despite public pressure to drop her habit and the difficulties it had caused her father and previous generations of the family, she continued to smoke, but was careful not to be seen doing so. Nevertheless, she remained attractive into her 60s, continuing to dress fashionably and eating little to avoid gaining weight. She was conscious about her place in the history books and was happy to be interviewed by reputable biographers and historians, spending her spare time organizing photos of her public appearances into albums. She maintained a full schedule of engagements in the 1990s, though they no longer attracted much attention as the torch was passed to a younger generation of working royals. While her civil list allowance was withdrawn in 1992 and replaced by an annuity from the Queen, it was the result of criticism directed largely at the younger members of the royal family. The publication of Margaret's love letters with Robin Douglas Hume in 1994 caused a major embarrassment. This was soon overshadowed by the finalization of Charles and Diana's divorce in 1996, the same year that Margaret's younger nephew, Prince Andrew, also divorced his wife, Sarah. Margaret acted in a hypocritical fashion at this juncture when she criticized Sarah for ruining the reputation of the royal family by engaging in an affair that contributed to the divorce. Her attitude towards Diana remained cool, and she was among the royals criticized for their lack of emotion after Diana and her lover, Dodi Al-Fayed, were killed in a car accident in Paris in August 1997. Margaret's later years saw her meet again, one last time, with Peter Townsend. In the summer of 1992, they met for lunch at Kensington Palace. It was 3.5 decades since their relationship had ended. Margaret was said to have noted that Townsend was the same as she remembered him, except for his greying hair. Peter died 3 years later of stomach cancer. Margaret did not attend the funeral. It is understood that she did not do so out of respect for Peter's widow and children. 3 years later, in February 1998, Margaret suffered a mild stroke on holiday in Mustique, which left her incapacitated and depressed, prompting her to hand over the villa to her son. The following year, on her final visit to Mustique, she suffered severe burns in a bathroom accident and was confined to a wheelchair for several months. While she was in better form during her 70th birthday celebrations in 2000, a series of strokes in early 2001 led to press reports that she was on her deathbed. While she survived and made an appearance at her mother's 101st birthday celebrations in August 2001, she died at the age of 71 on the 9th of February 2002, her sister's Golden Jubilee year. Following a private funeral service at Windsor on the 15th of February, her remains were cremated. Her mother died several weeks later at the end of March. At a memorial service for both mother and daughter on the 19th of April, Margaret's ashes were transferred to the King George VI Memorial Chapel in St. George's Chapel, Windsor. The obituaries that accompanied Princess Margaret's death presented her as a woman who was born with so much, but who often did not live up to her potential. Born in 1930 to the Duke and Duchess of York, her life was turned upside down in 1936 when her parents unexpectedly became King and Queen on account of her uncle's decision to abdicate rather than end his relationship with Wallis Simpson. Despite being within touching distance of the throne, from a young age, Princess Margaret gained a reputation for independence from her family. For much of the 1950s and early 1960s, she was the most popular member of the royal family, winning considerable public sympathy when she was forced to abandon her relationship with Peter Townsend. She also acted as a trailblazer for the modernization of the royal family. However, her troubled love life from the mid-1960s, her affairs and her expensive tastes caused public opinion to turn against her. Much of this was unfair. While never far away from scandal, Princess Margaret always remained conscious of her royal status and was guided by a sense of duty, firstly to her father George VI, and later to her sister Queen Elizabeth II. She diligently carried out royal engagements at home and abroad, even when her health suffered as a result. Ultimately, her life was a somewhat tragic one. She was prevented from marrying the man she wanted to, and then ended up in a loveless marriage that descended into controversy. Perhaps her life could have worked out very differently had it not been for the restrictions placed on her by her status as a royal princess. What do you think of Princess Margaret? Was she a tragic figure cursed by her status and the social attitudes of the day, which forced her to choose between love and duty, or did she bring calamities upon herself with her hedonistic lifestyle and extravagant tastes? Please let us know in the comments section. And in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.